Welcome to episode 7 of Metabolism, Diet, and Health. I'm Hunt Bobo, MD. Today we're going to talk about obesity and the metabolic syndrome with my personal observations. It's the carbohydrates, and not the fat, that are causing the problem. Let me see if I can get this thing to go to the next one. I'm going to reiterate concerns that I'd recommended to you in the past. You need to keep an archival family log online or on some type of archival write in the rain paper with your personal medical history and dietary history is part of that. Share it with your kids and your doctors so eventually your grand and great grandkids can know what they might expect and whether it's going to be autosomal dominant or autosomal recessive, and actually take steps to avoid whatever ailments have fallen your ancestors. Exercise daily as much as practical. I like to say an hour plus every day, and I bike ride, but we need to vary it and do stretching and, high intensity a little bit for the bones and the muscles, and medium and low intensity for the other benefits. Live a happy, well-balanced life, including eating a balanced diet, supplement with vitamins and minerals, especially if you're on some type of an odd restrictive diet like a vegan or carnivore, and eat the least processed foods possible. Like we mentioned before with the nitrates, I've never seen anybody with nitrate poisoning from eating pork, sausage, hot dogs, but every hot dog and sausage that I've seen in this house had some nitrates in it, and I think more people have died in the past from botulinum toxin from these smoked or preserved meats that didn't have nitrates in them than have had problems with the nitrates. But you can get into trouble with them, and if all you eat is salami, you probably have a higher risk of cancer, especially colon cancer or gastric cancer. The incidence of stomach cancer, which was like the second most common cancer in the early part of the 20th century, disappeared with the advent of refrigeration. Evidently, the smoked and preserved meats were causing this gastric cancer, and it went from being number 2 after lung cancer for men in 1910 or 1920 to almost being non-existent. It dropped 98% in the incidence. Strict vegans run the risk of having a B12 deficiency as well as other deficiencies of the essential amino acids that are provided more in meat than in vegetable sources. You may get plenty of grams of protein from the tofu or legumes, whatever you're eating, but they don't have the same quality of protein. In fact, the odd thing about eggs, egg whites were a fad for the high cholesterol people 20 years ago, and egg yolks were left out. There's actually more essential amino acids in the yolks than are in the whites. And it turns out dietary cholesterol does not do much to elevate most people's cholesterol. Again, I was a sophomore in medical school. I did a paper just for the school pathology course on a lipid tolerance test to administer cholesterol and triglycerides and see what the effect was on the blood work. Just like a glucose tolerance test. It seemed like a logical step, and everybody kind of looked at me sort of like a cow looks at the farmer when he's going in to clip the pasture. Didn't make sense, and now I hope we're getting around to having more individualized medicine. The carbohydrates are inflammatory and seem to be the driving source for elevated triglycerides, which are the dangerous component of your lipids and cause the heart disease more than the LDLs. Triglyceride to HDL ratio correlates better than any of the other lipid profile tests that we can get. Seed oils, which are, soybean, peanut oil, corn oil, whatever mixed vegetable oil in the grocery store, are pro-inflammatory because of the omega 6 to omega 3 ratio. And I think that's kind of unfair because an avocado is kind of a seed, and olive pits are kind of seeds. And olive oil and avocado oil have a more favorable mixture of the omega-3 and omega-6s, and are actually relatively anti-inflammatory, even if they're not absolutely anti-inflammatory. Carnivores, a strict carnivore such as an Inuit, Alaskan Eskimo that lives off of fish and whale and seal, does not get much fiber. There's really no fiber listed in the steaks and ground hamburger. And we have to have fiber. Fiber is essential to keep the gut moving. Fiber is essential to keep a healthy microbiome in your gut where the bacteria are metabolizing this fiber we can't break down. And they metabolize it actually into beneficial medium chain or short chain triglycerides that can be metabolized into ketones much easier by the liver. So the fiber is not directly a nutrient, but it's an essential dietary ingredient, and you need to get fiber. And if you're a strict carnivore eating nothing but bacon and steak and hamburger, maybe fish and eggs, you're not getting any fiber. You need some fiber. You know, if you smell the dung of a horse or a cow versus the dung of a dog or a cat, the carnivores stink a lot worse, and the bacteria associated with this are more carcinogenic, or at least associated with cancer in the alimentary tract. So I think that you need to have a balanced diet that consists of both plant and animal material to make sure you have the richest, densest nutrients and the least risk of cancer and heart disease. If you're not going to take a balanced diet where you have a bunch of leafy greens and cruciferous vegetables, then you need to take some supplements. If you're a carnivore, you know, you probably ought to be taking a couple of heaping teaspoons of Metamucil a day, which is both soluble and insoluble fiber. The soluble fiber actually, feeds the little beneficial bacteria, and the insoluble fiber acts as a carrier to kind of carry all of the other material that you're not absorbing down through your intestine. And it also acts as a sponge that slows down the uptake of glucose. If you eat just a big wad of cotton candy, it hits you almost like you gave it IV. But if you have the sugar and you literally eat the sugar cane with all that woody fiber in it and stuff, it does not leach out of the fiber mesh as much, and you don't get as much of a rise. And the enterohepatic circulation of bile salts that absorb cholesterol is interfered with. Some of the cholesterol and the bile salts get stuck to the fiber and go out the rear end, so it's actually a natural anti-cholesterol agent in that sense. So carbohydrates and seed oils are poison to most of us. Avocado and olive oil are better for you. Animal fats and cholesterol fats turn out not to be nearly as bad as previously thought. Triglycerides are the bad actor in the lipid profile and associated with cardiovascular disease, with the lowest mortality in relationship to cholesterol levels being around 210. This has been repeated in over a dozen different studies. The first one I know of was in Australia in the 1960s, where they did about 450 patients, and they universally found a U-shaped curve, shaped just like a U, with the lowest mortality at 210 cholesterol level, and 210 is considered abnormally high by U.S. lab standards. Yet, if you look at the cholesterol level dropping below 210, the mortality goes up. I'm going to give you some personal observations from my dieting experience. I've struggled with obesity my whole life, so I've had quite the opportunity to lose weight several times. The recommendations from the government changed every 4 or 5 years. It was hard to believe them. and they certainly didn't work for me. I learned early on that if I wanted to lose weight, I just quit eating for 2 or 3 days and then would eat just maybe one meal a day, which is now the fad termed intermittent fasting. And I also learned not to tell the doctors and the dietitians because they uniformly condemned it as being dumb and the wrong way to do it. But it worked for me. If I ate breakfast, I was hungry at 10 or 11 o'clock, and that breakfast usually included something like toast or some kind of breakfast cereal or something, as the carbohydrates made me feel hungry a few hours later. And I wanted to eat more than I'd planned. They would make me ravenous. This is called the standard American diet, and it was torture, SAD for short. But I noticed eating meat or dense vegetables like collards and cabbage, especially fat containing, a little bit of bacon or fatty pork in with the collards, sated me and keep me satisfied all day and keep me running all day. If I lagged a little bit from being tired, I wasn't hungry when I was fasting. Non-carbohydrate, snack, preferably high fat or, moderate protein. Protein, unfortunately, can be metabolized into sugar, and it's not as good as the fat as far as long-term satiation and not spiking your sugar. It can spike your sugar a little bit, but it would lift my energy level back up when I started to sag about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. I'd get a second wind. My triglycerides and cholesterol had always been normal, but when I stopped the carbohydrates, they improved significantly with the HDL coming up, triglycerides and cholesterol going down. I went to Walmart shopping, and this is a picture of the panoply of poisonous foods that we have. I had one. The whole aisle was chips, and they're really as expensive as the good food. This is a $60 bag of party-sized Cheetos, but pick your poison. Cheetos, corn chips, whatever. And there's this huge amount of confections and bread. If it's white, got carbohydrates in it, it's going to push your sugar up slow or fast, depending on how accessible it is. Powdered sugar is like IV sugar, and something that's mixed up in a starchy cellulose matrix doesn't go up as high. Incidentally, just to avoid confusion, cellulose is a carbohydrate, but it's linked in such a way that us humans cannot break it down. And bacteria are required by termites that eat the wood to break the wood down into the simple carbohydrates that they can use, like glucose, sucrose, mannose, and lactose. But there's a huge section of all these stuff you shouldn't eat. And this is also in Walmart. If you'll notice, the broccoli is only like $1.97 for a head. The center picture is my okra out of my garden I picked one day, and okra is idiot proof. I prefer this purple okra because it can get fairly large and long and still be supple and tender. If you let it get really big, which is a lot of my crop when I wouldn't pick for 3 or 4 days, it'll get woody as a toothpick. Makes for good seed for the next year, but it's indigestible by human beings and certainly unpalatable. But even these long ones in this picture, cut them up in little cross sections, and they're great. Then above that, there's kale above the broccoli on the right side, and then there was bell peppers. All these are good for you. There are people that have a concern, and I'm sure their patients or people, I think of everybody when I talk to them about that as patients, that have problems with some of the stuff in the peppers. They call it leaky gut syndrome. Some of us don't. Now, this is the meat stew I cooked yesterday. That's the whole venison tenderloin on the left, and I cut it up into 3/8 or 1/2 inch medallions and put in a bunch of celery and some carrots and a few little peppers, and put some hot peppers in there too, and then put in a handful of okra. So I had all of my animal-based vitamins and minerals. I mean, there is so much more bioavailable iron in this piece of venison you see here per ounce than there is in a white chicken breast. It's unbelievable. And the actual essential amino acids are much, much better. The right-hand side has fiber with the okra and celery and carrots and all that stuff, and mushrooms have some good nutrients in them, but they don't have the B12 and the bioavailable iron like this venison steak does. But look at the color of that. There's no marbling, not that I have anything as fat now. I've changed my whole opinion about that. And it's a high quality protein. You can't get any better than that. But also you could survive healthily and well off of peanuts, legumes, and just vegetables if you had some little B12 supplementation, or you were drinking some kind of fermented drink where there are bacteria that had produced enough B12. But you run the risk of having some deficiencies in stuff that's in that meat that's not in those vegetables. And certainly if you're an Inuit and eating nothing but meat, you're going to miss out on the vegetables and fiber. I think you need to have a little of both. This is a good review of the history of lipids and heart disease. I'll have a link down in the description of this. And I wanted to review the fatty acids again. Omega-3 fatty acids, which double bond starts 3 from the end away from the carboxylic acid group, are anti-inflammatory. They don't metabolize into arachidonic acid like the omega-6 fatty acids, which are pro-inflammatory. The current theory is atherosclerosis, or hardening of the arteries, which causes stroke and heart disease, is driven by inflammation. Corn, soybean, and peanut oil are pro-inflammatory. Interestingly, the rapeseed oil or canola oil seems to have a somewhat better lipid profile than the corn oil, soybean oil, and peanut oil. And of course, corn, soy are probably the two worst. And the rapeseed, I think, is a little better, canola, but they don't hold a candle in their beneficial effects to the olive oil and avocado oil, which are relatively anti-inflammatory. But be ready to change your dietary plans as new information comes out. And one thing that I think is not going to change that we all can agree on is carbohydrates are pro-inflammatory and non-essential nutrients. They provide energy. They will keep you alive. If you were locked in a place where you couldn't get anything but Cheetos, you'd certainly die quicker if you didn't eat the Cheetos. But if you can get better food, especially if it's the same price, you need to go over to the vegetable aisle. And the fresh vegetables are better for you than if you go get the canned collards or the canned mushrooms. Get the fresh ones and cook them yourself. And when you cook them, the heat labile vitamins are destroyed by prolonged excessive cooking. So fresh is better than overcooked. But I would not eat a raw crawfish and get some parasite and get sick, or trichinosis from undercooked pork, or food poisoning from the chicken. It's loaded with bacteria. You got to cook it up to temperature so you don't get sick. If you have actually been on a carbohydrate-free diet or extremely low carbohydrate diet, your body can adapt to running off of ketones. In fact, some people say the ketone metabolism gives you a clearer mentation, better brain function, and less neurologic problems in the long run. Certainly, back when I started medical school, we knew that a ketogenic diet and ketosis could be used to control pediatric seizures that you couldn't control with medicine. And that's been known as a treatment for seizures, since before I was in medical school. And I read now that there are people discovering you can control seizures with a ketogenic diet, and it's a wonderful new thing. Well, it's 60 years old. It's not new. It's been used before we had seizure medicines. So a ketogenic diet, people that are diabetic that go into a coma and have seizures when their glucose drops too far, if they were somewhat fat adapted and had ketones on board, you can run that glucose right on down to what will be fatal levels for most of us, and the patient will still be wide awake and not feeling bad. So try to stick with saturated fats and then the omega-3 polyunsaturated fats. I will actually go through a little demonstration next, two talks from now, where I'm going to take some different oils, check the temperature, then put them in the refrigerator and cool them down and see when they get hard, and then put them in the freezer and see when they get hard and what the temperature is. The longer the fatty acid chain, the higher the melting point, meaning if you have a 22 carbon fatty acid, it's going to be solid at room temperature. If you have a 6 carbon fatty acid, it's going to be a thin liquid at room temperature, and in between those. For a given length of a carbon, like a palmitic acid, 18 carbons long, the more double bonds you put in there, the more kinked and the more bent the fatty acid is, and the relatively shorter it is, and the lower the melting point. So an 18 carbon polyunsaturated or 20 carbon polyunsaturated fat like docosahexaenoic acid's got multiple double bonds in it, will have the same melting point as a 12 or 14 carbon straight saturated fatty acid. Animals have primarily saturated fatty acids. Plants vary from different types of fatty acids, and that's what we're talking about with the peanut and soy and corn versus avocado and olive oil. And the carbohydrate, the fatty acids that are saturated turn out to not be that bad for you. And the ones that are polyunsaturated, starting at the omega-6 or the inflammatory ones, are bad for you. The ones that are omega-3 are good for you. And you can convert a good olive oil, with olive oil being good for your health, into the worst one by heating it too much and getting it to smoking. You take this beneficial, helpful olive oil and you heat it up to where it gets to smoking, especially if you burn it, and the double bonds flip over and become saturated or become trans fatty acids. And trans fatty acids not only can't be metabolized by you, they just stick in your liver and stay there until you die or get cirrhosis and die. They can't even be metabolized by bacteria. The food industry was brilliant. They discovered this back in the 60s and realized you can take processed food products and put in trans fatty acids and make the shelf life go way up. And it really helps. So you have a Twinkie that's 10 years old and it looks brand new when it's in the wrapper. But that's because the bacteria can't metabolize it. I think it's a good operating plan to avoid things that can't be metabolized by bacteria. Join me next time. 2 times from now, I'll do the fatty acid demonstration with the refrigerator. And next time, I'm going to talk about the glycemic index and how it's good, but it's not the whole story and can be misleading. Turns out that fructose, which has a very low glycemic index, is 8 to 10 times more likely to glycate your hemoglobin and otherwise cause damage than glucose by itself. I'll see you later. Bye.